Good evening. This is the People's Platform. Now, we are continuing to see the growing numbers of citizens engaging in protest against the monumental failures by the government of the day, by elected representatives, and the failures brought on through abuse of power and or negligence. The protest opposite the Presidential Secretariat has reached its 21st day today. Elsewhere in the island, we see the manner in which people from the working classes are also converging from the free trade zone workers to the teachers, to the school principals, plantation workers, mothers of the disappeared from the south, from the north, from the east of the country, truly coming together. All of this a true testament to show that the people are truly reclaiming their power once more. Before embarking on tonight's discussion, here's a recap on what happened on episode 4.
So the first thing that I think our people have to realize is that governments have no money of their own. Governments have expenses to meet their responsibilities to the people, whether it's health, education, the police, the army, the whatever. So how do governments get the money for their expenses? Through taxes, the revenue, because in Sri Lanka, all our SOEs, state-owned enterprises, run at losses. They're another drain on the government, so there's no other forms of revenue. So it's all through taxes, and if the taxes cannot meet it, then you borrow. So over the years, the taxes have never been able to meet it. We have been borrowing, and in this case, we were already at a crucial.
So police has their own interpretation of what minimum use of force is. Now, certainly using live ammunition is not, use of minimum force. What the citizens need to understand is that the Constitution absolutely protects freedom of expression, especially political expression, when people are airing their grievances and political demands, and freedom of assembly and association.
Constitution says that with 51% before the 2.5 years, Parliament can have a resolution and they can go. But can they do it? No, because they have wasted national resources and they can't have an election. So therefore, to say that they have the mandate is, you challenge them, okay, go and have an election. They can't do it. So if you can't have an election and you can't test it, then you have no right to say the 6.5 people voted for you and therefore you can stay in power. And if you say that then, and they still refuse to go, then the question is the 21st Amendment. Because if there's absolutely no future for the country and they're refusing to go, then the only way is to take away completely the executive presidency. Then the president is forced to go and you have an interim government.
This is episode 5 of the People's Platform. Now, when those who are meant to ensure the legislative power and the executive power of the citizenry is in dereliction of the duties they owe to the people, it is important to decipher the way forward. Tonight's discussion will focus on constitutional responses to the political impasse. I'm so pleased to welcome on tonight's show two of the most eminent legal luminaries in Sri Lanka, Mr. Faiz Mustafa, President's Counsel. Good evening, sir, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you for having me on your show.
Mr. Jeffrey Alagaratnam, President's Counsel. Good evening and welcome, sir.
Thank you, Sonali.
My first question is to Mr. Mustafa. It's about the concept of holding the government accountable. We meet at a time when people's suffering is so dire and the helplessness of the common man is unprecedented. Time is of the essence. But if we take the manner in which the elected officials are acting, in complete disregard, it's almost sadistic. We see how the government's predominant focus is to find a way of retaining power, despite the fact that the overwhelming clamor of the people is for the head of state to resign. Is this not a colossal breach of governmental responsibility, breach of the public trust doctrine? And can we also look at how these solutions, temporary solutions, are being looked at? For example, the no confidence motion, this proposal of an interim government. How does this all feature in ensuring expedient solutions for the Republic?
Sonali used a very, very pertinent word. That is, there be total dereliction of duty by the government. So the government presently is totally dysfunctional. You would appreciate that even the basic necessities are not available. If you look at the constitution, I don't think it's tailor-made for this particular situation, so we got to improvise. And I think we should improvise within the constitution itself. Because we should find constitutional remedies, otherwise we will lead to anarchy and violence. The present clamor, as you said, of the people, we have regained our power, you say, the sovereignty is with the people. The clamor is for both the president and the prime minister to go. There is no question about that. That is a basic premise upon which we should operate. Now, as the prime minister is concerned, of course, there is a constitutional mechanism where you pass a no confidence motion and he has to go, and the parliament can elect a successor. There is a mechanism for that. Now, how do you get the president out? That is apparently the issue. From present indications, I don't think the president is prepared to go. And judging from the statement that Mr. Sirisena made this evening, the mechanism the president has also in mind ensures its continuity. I don't think that will go down with the protesters, and as you say, the protest is now expanding, and more people, it's becoming more and more inclusive. So I don't think you can sell that, and the basic provision should be resorted to. Namely, if you look at the constitution as a whole, you'll find the sovereignty is with the people. And surprisingly, now those directive principles of state policy, which do not written constitutional obligations as such, or they may come in useful at this juncture. And in fact, the basic tenet, if you look at Article 27, I believe, housing, for instance, clothing, shelter, food, these are essentials which any government, I mean, you don't need to write into the constitution, but these are the basic features and basic duties and responsibilities of any government. And here you would agree with me that there is a total failure to deliver, consequent to which I think the responsibility now shifts on the representatives. Unfortunately, we don't have this recall mechanism which you have in certain countries where you can recall your MPs, right? So we got to pressurize them to act. So I would foresee a no confidence motion of the president and the government, resorted to by the opposition or the members of parliament. And if that is passed, I would feel that the president is obliged to go in terms of the constitution itself, quite apart from other mechanisms or removal.
Right. Thank you very much, sir. Since you spoke about the directive principles of state policy, for the benefit of our viewers, let me draw reference to them. Article 27 of the Constitution says, the state is pledged to establish a democratic socialist society, which includes, the objective of which includes the promotion of the welfare of the people by securing and protecting a social order in which justice prevails. The realization by all citizens of an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, including adequate food, clothing and housing, the continuous improvement of living conditions, the rapid development of the whole country by means of public and private economic activity, the equitable distribution among all citizens of the material resources of the community, the establishment of a just social order in which the means of production, distribution and exchange are not concentrated and centralized in the state agencies or in the hands of a privileged few, but are dispersed among and owned by all the people of the country. Now, we must also note that it is said in Article 29 that the provisions of this chapter do not confer or impose legal rights or obligations and are not enforceable in any court or tribunal. But, sir, as you said, it's quite tragic to look at these directive principles and see how the country is now in the complete opposite state of affairs.
It's a philosophy, I believe, philosophy of the Constitution it imposes, and if you look at this article itself, it says the state is pledged to provide these. And also you'll find a subclause which says these are the guiding principles which will direct both the cabinet and the president.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a duty, and there's a duty on the parliament, the representatives, our representatives, to ensure that these are complied with. And if they don't comply, to ensure that it goes.
From what Mr. Mustafa said, Mr. Alagaratnam, can you tell us how can we pressure the 225 parliamentarians who are currently in Parliament to ensure the passage of the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which the Bar Association of Sri Lanka has also pushed for. You as a former president of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka as well, and you too were quite vociferous during your tenure. How does that feature?
Of course, it comes to a situation where you have 225 people who have different ideologies, different objectives. But I would think that the pressure has to come more extra constitutionally. That's how I see it.
Okay.
Because there has to be a certain amount of pressure brought upon them by the citizenry, because as Mr. Mustafa said, what is fundamental to the whole thing is that the constitution belongs to the people. And all these so-called representatives are only agents, if I may put it in another way, they are servants of the people. Unfortunately, as Mr. Mustafa says, we don't have the power to recall them, to take them back once they don't perform. Whereas in any other, now, the clamor of the so-called youth, the protesters, which has set this whole ball rolling, is that not only should the president and the prime minister go, but all 225 have been derelict.
Right.
And they have not played their role in parliament to ensure the basic rights of the people. So it's, the dysfunctional government is not only because of an inept or incompetent president and a prime minister, it also is because of an inept and an incompetent parliament.
Right.
So that I think the pressurizing of not only the opposition, the parliamentarians of the government to come together to say enough is enough, and that there should be, because you need a 2/3 majority for any constitutional amendment.
Right.
That is without a referendum, but I would, in the bar's view, we have suggested immediate repeal of the 20th Amendment, and for which you need a 2/3, and to bring back the 19th Amendment, which has certain deficiencies. But those things can be attended to. Now, those should be able to go through with only a 2/3. But the question is, how do we get the 2/3?
Right.
That's your question.
Right, yeah.
It's a bit of a tough question, but depending on, because as you can see, even to get 130 in majority in Parliament to pass a vote of no confidence on the Prime Minister or even anybody else is a bit of a tough call at the moment.
Right.
So I think it's where the people have to claim their sovereignty.
Okay.
And I think it is to a certain extent the pressure groups, whether it is the youth, the professions, which have to come to the fore, because I think we have to take responsibility, the professions and the older generations, because we have allowed this situation to continue for 74 years. It's not merely this government that has been derelict. There have been several governments, and it has come to a headway now. So how do the citizenry get involved and claim back their sovereignty? And one of the things is, I don't know whether in the form of a fundamental rights, whether you are violated by fundamental rights. You know, the Supreme Court to a certain extent has recognized that though it's not specifically included in the Constitution, we have a right to life. As Mr. Mustafa said, the principles of state policy, though not justiciable, can be read in as a part of fundamental rights. So that whether there is some way of pressurizing them through the judicial mechanism is another aspect that may be considered to make the cabinet or whoever is functioning now responsible for bringing about a state of stability and yielding to the will of the people. Because we want it this way, and you have violated our fundamental rights. You have to accept that you're no longer able to run this country. You have hit ground zero. So can we urge those in Parliament through various mechanisms, either extrajudicial or judicial, to come together to see us through this impasse with a 2/3?
That's right. I don't think by itself the restoration of the 19th Amendment by itself, without the change of heads, would suffice, because the clamour is that there has to be a paradigm shift.
Okay.
So by itself, otherwise you merely repose power in the Prime Minister, you take it away from the President and repose it in the Prime Minister.
Right.
So that doesn't help. By itself doesn't help. It has been overall, it's a total overall.
Yes, I agree with Mr. Mustafa, because the 19th had, as it were, the problems of two repositories of power, and there was a tug of war at one stage. So that's why I think the 19th Amendment is not perfect, but it's a good start which requires a little fine-tuning.
Right. Okay. So today, former President Maithripala Sirisena said that the President has agreed to appoint an interim cabinet led by a new Prime Minister. He was speaking to reporters after a meeting with the president this afternoon. And I'm reading the dubbed version. The president, he says, the president responded positively to set up an interim cabinet led by a new prime minister. We will need a small cabinet of about 15 to 20 ministers with a new prime minister under this interim government. The cabinet will be vested with the task of carrying out duties of the interim government. The president also agreed to set up a national council. It will make decisions on the appointment of the prime minister, ministers. The national council will decide on the appointment of ministry secretaries, IGP, attorney general. The president and the cabinet will have to act according to the advice of the national council. This goes against the constitution, doesn't it?
So I don't say that. This is maybe this is Mr. Sirisena's understanding of what the president said, because ex prima facie it appears to be violating the constitutional
Absolutely.
Apart from being violated the constitution, there's a lot of vagueness, the lack of clarity.
Yes.
You know who is going to do what, and besides, it undermines the very cry that is coming out. I personally believe the majority of the people that the president and the prime minister must go. Quite apart from the cry for the 225 to also go, and that is why even the bar has advocated firstly the president should resign, because there is a clause in the constitution where he can tender his resignation. So one expects, when one cannot, there has been a series of failures, and one has to be responsible enough to take responsibility and say, in a private sector, one just resigns honorably and goes home before you are terminated, right? So that one should realize the feel of the people and know that you have brought us to this stage. I'm not saying that it's only this president who has brought us. Maybe serious presidents have done equally badly, or
probably not worse.
So, lot worse. But one has to have the humility to understand that there's a big breach of trust, a huge credibility gap in your ability to perform. I'm not talking of corruption or abuse of power. You're incompetent, inept. You have failed to deliver, and you have made all the wrong judgments and decisions on several counts. So you can't insist, you should not, it's not fair to the country and the people that you should insist on remaining. So too with the Prime Minister, so too with the whole cabinet, and perhaps the 225 as these young people are clamoring for. And that is why we have said the President, Prime Minister should resign, immediately repeal the 20th Amendment, which has created a lot of problems for us. The 19th Amendment, as Mr. Mustafa says, needs fine-tuning, because you can't have the President and the Prime Minister at loggerheads. Caretaker cabinet, because our immediate problem is the economic problems, where we have to survive that. And that's going to take a long time, maybe a year or two. And that's for the economists to get us out of this mess. And therefore, we need an interim cabinet which has the confidence of the people, either from across the parties or from outside expertise which guides this cabinet, or bringing in experts through a national list. Those are various mechanisms.
Sure.
But enough is enough as far as the President and the Prime Minister and the present cabinet or those in the government go.
So a cabinet which commands the confidence of the public.
Public, yes.
Right. Now,
reflected reflected in Parliament, of course.
Yes. So all of these conversations that are happening with the government, amongst government and opposition members, when time is of the essence and the country is in crisis, no decisions are being made. So how does one go about resolving this or addressing this?
There seems to be a stalemate, right?
Yeah.
The only way seems to be, I think, the present proposal ensures a continuity of the president, which I don't think will go down with the protesters, nor will be accepted by the country at large.
Right.
To it also impinges upon the functions of the cabinet. An interim cabinet will be hamstrung by these proposals. So, to my mind, the only way the impasse out of the way, out of the impasse presently, appears to be to pass a vote of no confidence on the president in the first instance. Okay. And it does, of course, by itself effect a resignation, but he will be obliged to go. And if he goes, the incumbent president was elected. The acting president will have to be supported, will have to be thereafter supplanted by an incumbent president. And that income president can call upon the person with the majority in the House to form an interim government and give some limited goals. And also I think there should be assurance that the parliament elections be held within a year and that the executive presidency will be abolished within that time span.
Right.
That might to some extent meet the demands of the people. And also we should address the question of corruption. I think that is very paramount.
Sure.
If you notice only, the 19th Amendment had a procurement agency. I think most of this corruption springs from what are known unsolicited bids. And they're mind-boggling figures, they're huge figures. We should set up an independent procurement agency and make the unsolicited bids an exception, right? And also it should be screened and reported to Parliament.
Right.
If there are any unsolicited bid, Parliament should be made aware. And there should be specific guidelines for how you should treat tenders and any bids. Because that is the source of most of the corruption. Secondly, I would also advocate that all the 225 be called upon to declare the assets. And that time window within which a member of the public can challenge it. And if it is challenged, there should be a report from the Auditor General to Parliament. And a copy sent to the Bribery Commission also to see whether any legal steps may be taken. Because we should address the issue of corruption because that is paramount, I find,
Yes.
from what is being said by the protesters.
If we take the current constitution and the 20th Amendment to the constitution, Mr. Alagaratnam, it speaks of the parliamentary council, which replaced the constitutional council, political appointments, the prime minister, speaker, leader of the opposition, nominee of prime minister, nominee of the leader of the opposition. Here, what it says is that the president shall appoint the members to the Election Commission, Public Service Commission, National Police Commission, Human Rights Commission, Bribery Commission, Finance Commission, Delimitation Commission, Chief Justice and the Supreme Court and Court of Appeal judges, the Judicial Service Commission members, the Attorney General, Auditor General, the Ombudsman, Secretary General of Parliament and the Inspector General of Police. Can you take us through the absolute deviation from separation of powers and how terrible this is for a democracy?
Of course, my fundamental position is that the whole of the 20th Amendment should go lock, stock and barrel. But if you look at this method of appointment, that parliamentary council is just a rubber stamp for the president. If you look at the language used there, he has to only just consult them. They have no binding decision making as far as the president goes. Unlike if you look at the 19th Amendment, there was a constitutional council which had to recommend, so the president cannot sort of pick somebody from out of the sky and appoint him for a position. So there was a fair amount of control because after all and so that there are certain checks and balances so that there cannot be absolute power in any single organ like the president or even the cabinet of ministers because that impinges on for example, the judiciary. The judiciary is the third pillar. That's very important because there have to be checks and balances. So that if, for example, the judiciary is made subservient to the whims and fancies of one person, the president, that does not augur well for independence of the judiciary, for the interests of the country. Because after all, the ultimate source of protection for the people is the judiciary. They decide disputes between individuals as well as the last bastion for the protection of fundamental rights and the rights of the citizen against the state. And what we forget is both the president, the cabinet, parliament and the judiciary all exist for the state. So when they overstep their limit, there should be somebody to control them. So if the president calls the shots in who he appoints, that is whims and fancies, where there is no control, no transparent procedure as to eligibility, integrity, I mean, that undermines the whole idea. You cannot have a perfect checks and balance situation, but there has to be a fair degree of control of one organ by another in the event of abuse. This is totally lost under the 20th Amendment, where everybody is, as it were, subservient. One of the typical examples is when you found that at a committee stage, Under the 20th Amendment, not even in the amendment, at a committee stage, they appointed so many judges to the Supreme Court and Court of Appeal saying we are going to deal with the backlog of work. Expanded this court, where they did not have enough rooms also to give these poor judges. So I always believe that justice comes by quality and not by quantity. But the question is, having done that at a committee stage, not even in an appointment, it just shows the interference of the president with the judiciary itself at that initial stage. And if one even looked at the oaths giving of these judges, the president was on a high pedestal, and here were these judges that were fawning and servile like, going to take the appointment letters from him, where the president was sitting about 8 to 10 feet above them. So it just shows the imbalance within the vital organs of state. The optics were wrong, apart from what was done.
Both the composition is flawed and there's no teeth. If you look at composition, you'll find I find the president, you'll find the president and the prime minister, and also the nominee. I can't understand the purpose of them being present, and the nominee is also being included.
All right. We are in conversation with the President's Counsel, Mr. Faiz Mustafa, and President's Counsel, Mr. Jeffrey Alagaratnam. We'll be back after this short commercial break. You're watching the People's Platform.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
තනිව යන්න බෑයි කියන කාරණේද අධ්‍යාපනයේදී මම කියන්නේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදුවෙන දේ.
අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව සීන සමාජවාදී ඒකත් හරියන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක මේ කකුලට පොඩි. අපි අපේම සපත්තුව මහ ගන්න ඕනේ කියලා.
එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මානව හිමිකම් කවුන්සිලය කියලා කියන්නේ මානව හිමිකම් පිළිබඳව ලෝක පාර්ලිමේන්තුව.
අපි පරිසරය කියන්නේ දෙකක් තිබුණා.
මම ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලෙත් මේක තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්. දැන් මම මැරෙන්න යන කාලෙදි තුන්වන ලෝකේ රටක්.
ආණ්ඩුව රූපාන්තරණය වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය බවට.
එත දෙකේ එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැෂනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී, රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කවුද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද?
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not seconding to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID. This will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics, Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
Welcome back. This is the People's Platform. Now, whilst the country is embroiled in a political impasse, economic calamity, we'd also like to remind you, the citizens of the Republic, to also ensure that you look into your mental well-being. Mental health, psychosocial care must be ensured at all times. I'd like to move on to a tweet by Ananda Galapatti. He says, trained mental health and psychosocial volunteers are at the Golface protest next to the SLRC tent to provide support for organizers and protesters. Do visit this tent if you want to discuss taking care of yourself and others during protests. He also goes on to say, if you see this badge at the Gore-Face protest, do feel free to speak with the trained mental health psychosocial volunteer wearing it, or visit the psychosocial support tent in the medical services area. The badge says, "We are here to listen." We've seen the manner in which people have also spoken out about how overwhelming this whole situation has been for them. Since people are going through economic hardship, mental health issues, if you too are struggling with having someone to talk to, someone to listen to, you can reach out to these mental health hotlines that you see on your screen now. The National Institute of Mental Health has a hotline. The CCC Foundation has a hotline. Women in Need, Shanti Margam, also NGOs providing counseling services, mental health care. All right, moving back to the constitutional crisis at hand. We are in the presence of two constitutional experts, Mr. Faiz Mustafa and Mr. Jeffrey Alagaratnam, President's Counsel. Mr. Mustafa, something that is an idea that is floated when we say bring back our stolen money, according to the protesters, is this concept of a forensic audit. Can you speak to us about the practicality of auditing incomes, wealth that has been amassed through corrupt, illegal means, and also the dimension where we can seek international assistance, technical assistance if required?
Of course, what has happened is that in regard to declaration of assets, it has been, I think, observed mainly in the breach. And even the details that are filled in are not complete. So maybe we could ask the commission, the bribery commission, to look into the declaration more in detail for the moment. But in regard to recovery of stolen assets, the perception seems to be right or wrong. The perception seems to be that some wealth has been stashed away. Now, there is an initiative known as STAR, Recovery of Stolen Assets. It's an initiative by the World Bank with the UN, where efforts are made to recover assets of a state which have been filtered away. In fact, this was successfully resorted to, I'm told, in Egypt, and when they traced how Mr. Hosni Mubarak's son's assets abroad. I'm also told that in 2015 we did invite STAR to come into Sri Lanka, but apparently there was no follow-up. And people like Dr. Nihal Jayavikram, who's here, they are more, I think, more proficient in this area. Maybe you could get their assistance and have some liaison with STAR as a start.
Okay, amazing. Mr. Alagaratnam, your views on this? Repatriating wealth stolen or amassed through corrupt means?
Yeah, as Mr. Mustafa explained, STAR is one of the main bodies that can assist. Of course, that requires, if I remember right, intergovernmental
request from the government.
Yeah, yes. You and I can't request it, or the bar association may not be able to request it, but it has required. That's why, as Mr. Mustafa said, it was invited in 2015 and nothing happened after that. So that you need a lot of work between governments to get STAR to be active and to help assist us. They are not going to come at the beck and call of others. And the other thing is, it's a bit of a long drawn out process, because as some people say, there are certain states which are branded as rogue states from which you cannot easily ascertain what assets are stashed away. So it's a little bit of a tough call. But I think to a certain extent that is an avenue worth pursuing and has to be pursued, because one cannot continue with draining monies of a country. After all, it's the money of the citizens, the people, so that it has to come back. The other thing I was thinking of, long ago there was this case of Attorney General versus Reed in Hong Kong, where, of course, there if you can identify assets which have been stashed away by persons in authority, that is ill-gotten gains. And the common principle is, anybody who makes a secret profit or a gain while holding an office owes that money back to the person who appointed him. So that is state money. So if you have taken a bribe or something, or you built a house, as Mr. Mustafa says, which you cannot account for, under the RTI that belongs to the Republic of Sri Lanka, because you were only an agent of the people. While being an agent, you made a secret profit. And therefore, that cannot belong to you. It has to be traced back. And I think you were also talking of this, there's another mechanism on odious debts, as you say.
Yes. So this concept of, let me also just read out for the benefit of our viewers, this definition of a concept that was floating around. Odious debt, the definition by Sack, Alexander Sack, he says, if a despotic power incurs a debt not for the needs or in the interests of the state, but to strengthen its despotic regime, to repress its population that fights against it, etc., this debt is odious for the population of the state. This debt is not an obligation for this nation, it is a regime's debt, a personal debt of the power that has incurred it. Consequently, it falls within this power. How feasible is it for this concept? I'm reading off the concept of odious debt in public international law. How common is this concept?
It's not very common, but fundamentally, I think, I don't know whether Mr. Mustafa will agree with me, but if the odious debt has been incurred purely for a despot's purpose, like for example, grandeurs, constructions and opulence, then the question is, it's not only like in a bride, the giver and the taker. It's also the despot plus the person who gave the financial facilities. Because you know, ordinarily, any bank is not going to lend to you unless you're creditworthy, unless there's a feasibility study as to whether the project you want the money for is going to be able to pay back. So, but if you have incurred these type of mega deals or projects on debts purely for your own aggrandizement or for your own ego purposes to govern, then aren't you, the ruler, together with the lending institution who has been negligent, both liable jointly for this odious debt which is oppressing the people and the country? So whether action can be taken against them to state, for example, that Sri Lanka is not bound to pay this debt. It's an odious debt because it has not been incurred for the benefit of the country. It is the despot's personal agenda, his ego trip. And the man who lent it, or the institution that lent it, has been reckless, not merely negligent, in having lent this debt, especially sometimes at high interest rates. So whether that can be championed in that manner is another possibility.
That's our liability.
Yes. To say they are not liable, the country is not liable.
Recovery is another mechanism. Recovery is another mechanism. This refers to the obligation of the state to repay. It's more like, it's for their personal aggrandizement and not for the national welfare.
I'd like to move back to this concept of ensuring people's sovereignty. So, oftentimes we believe that, some of the people believe that your obligation as a voter ends after you cast the vote. But now we see this resurgence in public consciousness where people are realizing that the country needs to be governed in their best interests. How do we best ensure that going forward? Mr. Mustafa?
Maybe the recall mechanism may be a way out, because a lot of countries have, as you know, a mechanism by which if, for instance, a large part of the electorate is dissatisfied with the performance of his member of parliament, they can have a set in motion a process for recall. And then there is virtually like another election. So maybe we could filter out, if people feel that they are not proactive in parliament, they could filter them out. Of course, you should have mechanisms so that it's not abused and the stability of the government should not be affected. But in long term, that we can explore that mechanism. Because now most of the representatives are immune to the wishes of the people. Once you elect them, they are law themselves.
And as Mr. Mustafa says, the recall mechanism is very effective provided it's not abused. So you have to make sure that maybe at least 10% of the voting, the registered voters of an area present a petition, and if they lose it, whether they lose their deposit. So there has to be responsive invocation of that mechanism to cancel the mandate of the person you sent to Parliament. And I would also say that one of the things for accountability that you can ensure is the independence of the institutions. Because under the 19th Amendment, there was a heavy lobby for having civil society in the Constitutional Council.
Yes.
To have at least 5 members, among the 7 being from civil society, not elected members of Parliament. Unfortunately, that got diluted. So that by ensuring that some of these institutions have eminent, independent civil society persons, they would be the foil to the parliamentarians getting out of hand. So one is the mechanism for recall, and the Independent Police Commission, Elections Commission, Constitutional Council, to ensure that all these people who are holding key positions in public office are not beholden to the parliamentarian or the politician and can act independently.
Yeah. So sometimes as fallible human beings, we tend to hope for the existence of the perfect set of legislators or the perfect head of state who will rise to the occasion, be inclusive, altruistic, act in the best interest of the country's people, be non-racist, non-sexist, non-homophobic, and ensure economic growth and economic development. But the contention with that kind of thinking is that is what happens when you have a leader who is not all those qualities. So we need to essentially ensure that institutions are strengthened and that the powers of the head of state, whoever he or she may be, are subject to checks and balances and controls and safeguards. So
and definitely a more effective way of removal than the present impeachment procedure for the president.
Because now the president virtually entrenched, except for the mechanism of impeachment.
Which will take at least a year.
It's tedious. And tedious, hazardous, and also the speaker has tremendous power. If he turns it down, then you've got to have a 2/3. Even to tender the impeachment papers. That's a totally practicable method.
The father of the Constitution, J.R. Jayawardene, is supposed to have boasted that I put in place a mechanism by which I cannot be removed.
It's virtually so. It's almost airtight. As far as he's concerned. But I think on this, the question of corruption, it strikes me. Most of these MPs should have tendered a declaration of assets. Probably most of them will do it pro forma. But what we could do now is to require them to make it public. And if any member of the public challenges it, it should be referred to the Bible Commission for investigation and report to Parliament.
So right now it's not compulsory.
It is compulsory.
There are about 10 who have publicly disclosed their assets. Public disclosure is not compulsory.
Not compulsory.
Yeah.
But this disclosure the speaker is, but they should make it public.
Yeah, because the point is, if you are a representative of the public, you want transparency.
In fact, there's a secrecy clause in the Act, so even if I look at the document, I can't disclose it to another third party.
That's incongruous with the concept of democracy and you being a representative of the people who have to look after the sovereignty of the people. You're accountable to them.
Yeah.
And the purpose is lost. If income is static, it's a different matter. If assets won't remain static, you should be able to fathom whether in fact there has been unconscionable increase. What is the purpose of a declaration otherwise?
So my final question, Ms. Alagaratnam, if you could in 3 minutes outline the way forward to resolve this political impasse by using the Constitution of the Republic. What are the measures that need to be taken?
Well, I think of course the immediate thing we have to address is to get some sort of an interim cabinet or government going to address the dire economic situation we are in. But it is incumbent on the people to repeatedly call upon and ensure that the President and the Prime Minister step down, because there is provision in the Constitution for them to resign. And that is something that we expect them to honorably do when they have failed over at least the last 3 years on several counts miserably. And there's a breach of trust, there's a huge credibility gap, and the country is going to head towards anarchy at minimum, unless these people see good sense and let the country run with a new set of persons who are efficient and capable of pulling us out of this mess. So the call for the president to resign, because unfortunately we cannot use the impeachment mechanism, and the prime minister to resign and set up an interim cabinet to pull us out of this economic morass, together with far-reaching constitutional changes. Repeal of the 20th, the 19th Amendment, as Mr. Mustafa says, with certain refinements, and if at all, the future abolishing of the presidency, together with elections. So, but as to whether there is a coercive remedy or a compulsive remedy that can resort to, it's very difficult to say at this stage. It much depends on the people and how the people demand accountability and ask the present government to go.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mustafa?
I agree overall. I think primary objective should be to hold them accountable. And that we should use the constitutional mechanism. Probably the way no confidence motion is the way to go in the first instance against the government. It's no point having these figures remain in their post, but nevertheless tinker with the 19th Amendment and bring it back, because you're only then divesting power from one and reposing it in another. So if I also agree with the concept of an interim government, but there should be deadlines. It should be limited to a particular period, and election should also be stipulated as due to occur within a specified time. In addition, we should get rid of the executive presidency, and that also should have a timeline. So the interim government should be empowered, or should require obliged to reach these objectives. And the interim government should be limited to about 18. And I would also suggest that no perks be granted except the pay as members of parliament. If they want to serve, they are welcome to serve. And they should deliver within this period. And then also, apart from bringing the 19th Amendment back, ensure also that these commissions, that the appointments are, again, there is a reappraisal of the appointments within a specified period. And that too be handed back to the Constitutional Council, which should be right to review these appointments and make fresh appointments. And at the same time, bring those mechanisms like the procurement agency and strengthen the bribery department, so that we get rid of corruption and have an overall of the entire system.
How hopeful are you that this situation can be resolved?
Now that I think people have taken something into their own hands and articulated it, I am hopeful that we will succeed. And I only hope that we don't drift to anarchy and find some constitutional methods of reaching objectives.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and your perspectives on tonight's episode of the People's Platform. Thank you so much, Mr. Faiz Mustafa and Mr. Jeffrey Alagaratnam, for being here with us and for sharing your thoughts with our audience. Thank you very much for your time and for watching us, for your feedback that keeps coming in. Thank you and good night.